Okay, so does anyone have a question for any of us here? So Beth, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. You mentioned about competency, which was really fascinating. Were you saying that it used to be that we generally thought everybody is competent to kind of run his own life, and then now we defer to experts? And how can I read more about that so I can get a kind of like become fluent so I can speak about that to other people?
Sure. So the question has to do with competence and the notion that Joshua Mitchell presents in some of his writing, that in the American Republic there was the assumption of competence with regard to the citizenry. So a competent citizenry can be entrusted to govern itself. And then we get to with the progressives, with Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt and those guys, where we have an elite expert class who are competent, who run the administrative state and manage the rest of us, and that's kind of thing. So she's wondering if there's something that we can direct her to that speaks to citizen competency. Now, I guess Tocqueville comes to mind. Democracy in America. That's not like a exclusively dedicated to that theme, but that's certainly something that runs through that work, because he's just observing, the American Republic in the early, 19th century, and he's describing it for his readers in France. And he, notes that essentially you have is, acquisitive, true, but also responsible citizens in America who manage their own affairs and don't need to be governed by a set of aristocrats. But is there anything that comes to your mind, guys?
Yeah, I don't actually know anybody who's addressed the topic. I think Tocqueville may be your best choice.
Yeah, and this past weekend I took a little trip up to the village of Sturbridge. I know you guys know that. I think one or both of you recommended I go. But one of the things you see of that time in that town, it's a historic village. What is it?
Early 19th century. Early 19th century. My daughter,
1830, somewhere around there.
Yeah, my daughter was one of the reenactors there. Yeah, one summer.
Oh, okay. Well, what you see is how everyone is productive and competent in a variety of things, and how that plays into the advancement of the society. And you can see the levels of advancement right there in the actual building, and the way that even the very houses change shape and style, and in the way in which everyone is interacting. And also competent and productive. I mean, it's stunning.
Well, this is what Mitchell is getting at. So Mitchell teaches at Georgetown. He's a political philosopher, teaches at Georgetown. And his observation is that in mediating institutions, families, churches, neighborhood associations, small businesses, that's where competence is absolutely necessary for things to function. It's only when you get into large institutions, sort of large corporations, factories, where you have people told that they have to focus on a very narrow range of things. And this is, the guy who's screwing on the bolt on the car. This is the guy in the cubicle who only deals with one sliver of information every day, and consequently have no sort of sense of the whole.
And interestingly, before you finish that, is one of the things I saw one of the guys playing in costume a guitar from the period, which was modeled exactly on a guitar of the period, which was by the Martin Corporation, who makes guitars to this day, and some very nice ones. Well, interestingly, is Martin back then was involved with cabinet making, but loved making guitars. But he was at the time trying to sell the guitars basically in Germany, but Germany refused to allow him to sell guitars and trade because he was not trained by their masters, right? They had a kind of particular craftsmanship that they would only bless. So he ends up coming to the U.S.
Germans don't innovate. I mean, they
That's right.
we innovate.
Right.
and then they take and perfect.
So he comes here, and we know the rest of the story.
Right. That's
Yeah.
fun. That's fun.
Yeah, Chris, what you're saying about competence in small businesses and intermediate institutions and such actually reminds me of Machiavelli.
Yeah.
Machiavelli argued that Florence ought to be by rights a republic, but the people lacked the virtue necessary to make it run. And so what needed to be done is the institutions of society had to be revitalized in order for the people to have an environment in which to learn virtue so that they can once again restore the republic.
Yeah. Larson.
I guess as and this may or may not be a question as much as just me trying to wrap my head around what you guys were saying, and at least what came out in my head to be somewhat of the point maybe is that he's starting all the way back with Augustine and sort of the degradation of the personal and the sanctity of human beings, all the way up to today. The story seems to be almost that with all of the right conditions in place, pragmatism, utilitarianism, and so on and so forth, we've ended up in a place where we almost have, it seems like, this emergent distributed totalitarianism, like where you don't need a Mussolini or a Hitler. Aspiring elites volunteer are
Right.
conscripted voluntarily
Right.
to be part of the totalitarian machine.
Right.
Is that?
Yeah. So the comment, guys, is that we find ourselves in a situation where, because of the intellectual trends that have brought us to this point, pragmatism, et cetera, and because of certain other developments in our society, we no longer need a Hitler or a Mussolini. This is something that our elites volunteer to institute without some madman threatening them, which is, but how to respond to that statement? I think that's true. I think your comment's true, Larson. And my take on it is that elites, generally speaking, don't really believe in anybody but elites. And it doesn't matter how much they fail, or how silly they become, or how much evidence they have just in the daily, sort of experience that they have of actually watching people competently manage themselves. They just don't believe in them. What do you guys think? Any thoughts?
I mean, I've often thought about, what would it take, or could something happen in which a kind of a self-reflection in someone from that world could arouse them to a more truthful way of living. And I don't know. I mean, I think you figure someone, I think you think of someone who threw the elite political class off in our culture was, a crass, businessman like Trump. And Trump didn't come so much speaking some kind of absolute truth or anything else. But he did expose a kind of something that they didn't want to let out of the bag, right? Is how much they were selling the rest of us down the river in many cases and benefiting from it. But it didn't change them. They basically said the best thing we can do is get rid of this guy, create another untruth. And so I don't know.
Yeah, my sense is Trump had great political instincts and recognized a resentment that was already there. He just threw fire on it, or oil on the fire, so to speak.
Yeah.
So it was there. In my entire life, I've witnessed resentment against elites, and it's been getting stronger over the course of my life.
I think now it's probably at fever pitch from the temperature gauges I'm reading about.
Yeah, and I think that elites, rather than sort of get the wake up call and say, "Wow, we better change our approach," their approach was, "Well, we just need to get rid of this guy, and everything will go back to normal." Yeah,
this is looking at it from the opposite end of the of the question. I think we're asking why there's a revolt against them. The question is, how did they get to where they are, where they don't need a Hitler, a Mussolini, a Stalin, a Mao, a Pol Pot, or whatever to lead them? And I think the answer is, frankly, found in the success of the strategy of the New Left going all the way back to the late 60s and 70s, where they very self-consciously took over systematically the key institutions that they understood as being the levers of culture. That is to say, media, education, law, and politics. And so what we have is a cohesive, coherent elite that is all bought into a single ideology. And as a result, it becomes self-reinforcing. As soon as one part of it moves in one direction, the rest of it moves with it, because they're all basically ideologues.
Yeah, I think that's right, Glenn. And I think that a lot of good-hearted people who are, local folks who try to contribute to the welfare of their local communities are still largely in the dark about this, and it's hard for them to accept the truth. So there is your tinfoil hat uncle who sees a conspiracy in everything, and he's been seeing it forever. And then there are people who are kind of reluctantly saying, yeah, I really do think this is getting insane. But there are still a lot of folks out there because maybe they just don't know anybody personally who are members of the elite. The three of us have had the misfortune of knowing many of these people personally, and having arguments with them in different settings. And so it doesn't catch a person by surprise if they've been in Madison or Oxford or Cambridge or places like that. We've seen it, for 20, 30, 40 years. And it's not going to go away. That's the other thing. I think a lot of good-hearted people really think this is a fad. It'll go away. It'll blow over. It's going to go back to normal again. No, it's not. This is something that's been building for, hundreds of years and has kind of gotten a lot worse in the last 30, 40. But anyway, other questions? Yeah.
I was just curious if any of you guys saw the Tucker Carlson interview with Kanye West, especially his commentary on how elites and elite influencers, I think the example he used was his wife, Kim Kardashian, and how they're surrounded by these influential people to teach them what to fear, and so steer their public persona and endorsing COVID or whatever.
Yeah, I didn't see that. I find it easy to believe, but the comment is that there was an interview with Kanye West by Tucker Carlson, and Kanye talks about how elites have tried to steer, public figures, pop stars, et cetera, to help promote, the sort of the agenda that the elites want to see promoted. For example, with COVID or whatever. Did either of you guys see that interview?
Yeah, I'm aware of it, but I didn't watch it.
Yeah, I didn't see the interview, but I mean, I think he's saying what you're not allowed to say from that world, and I think he's caught in the middle of a lot of struggles of trying in some way to have some sense of integrity, and
he strikes me as being like J.K. Rowling. He's too big to really cancel. So he's just kind of written off as a kook, like she's written off as like an angry, sort of second wave feminist who can't accept the new world, that kind of thing, even though she's just basically saying, there really are differences between men and women, that kind of thing.
He's internalized the patriarchy.
Did you see what somebody actually tweeted to J.K. Rowling? How can you stand to look at yourself in the mirror when you realize how many thousands or tens of thousands of fans you've lost? And she says, I look at my royalty checks.
That's right. 32 million last quarter. I feel pretty good. Well, I'll get to you, Gideon, in a minute, but yeah.
It's maybe a two-part question, but in regard to competency in utilitarianism, the thing that strikes me is what that is in the church. How there's very much the feeling as a member to be useful, and a lack of trust in our competency as parents. And so I guess kind of wanting to know where that came from. How is it that form of church order has become common? That I've noticed it a couple of times in different churches that there's just a general lack of considering us as competent, and then as we're useful for tithing, for missions, or but not necessarily for anything local or for our own children.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I think I can see what you're talking about. I've seen it. So the comment is a lot of folks in their churches feel patronized, or maybe they're told that they're not competent to do the things that they actually are competent to do, like raise their kids. And at the same time, they're used by church leaders to further the institutional, say, agenda or goals of the institution through giving or whatever, I guess my thought would be that, as a pastor, there has been a transition in the last, say, 50 years with regard to the model pastor. What is the pastor to be understood as doing? And we've gone from a kind of a biblical way of thinking about pastoral ministry to a corporate approach. So you are a successful pastor if you are the CEO of a growing corporate body, a corporation, and that's what, sort of behind a lot of the, say, strategies that you see in mega churches, where you're trying to maybe sell a particular thing, the gospel, to particular market segments, youth, moms, moms with kids. I mean, you really break it down really far, you end up with all these sort of things. And you lose sight of sort of the creation, and what's included in the creation is the family unit and how that's supposed to be functioning as sort of a whole.
But where did the church lose sight of the importance of the family? That's where I don't understand where the break in that. Like, I see why the world would not have value for the family, but how could the church?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Well, because the church is corrupt. Just kind of put it bluntly. Because many times churches are being measured by certain things. So just think about it this way. So very often a pastor receives his kind of social credibility based on the size of his congregation, or the amount of money that has been contributed to that work, things of that nature. And then you say, well, how can I engineer this to get more of that, those sorts of things? And you lose touch with certain basic biblical practices and ways of thinking that were true, that characterized pastoral ministry maybe in earlier times. So there's kind of a market-driven industrial sort of mindset that comes into play.
The car and the camera, that's what did it, right? In a way.
Well, the car means that you can go a long way to church, right? Yeah. Yeah.
More glory.
Yep. Yeah. There. The joke in ministry is you have, if you heard of the Oedipus complex, there's the Oedipus complex. In other words, the more you're building, the more important you are.
Now, the traditional measures are sometimes called the ABCs: attendance, buildings, and cash.
Yeah.
It's sometimes also called the 3 Bs.
Yeah, I know what you're
buildings, budgets, and butts.
Anyway, those are some cheerful thoughts. But yeah, Gideon.
Yeah, I've got a couple questions here. I'll try to kind of boil them down. Can you talk a little more about competence and how it specifically relates to elitism and utilitarianism? Because I haven't connected those two together before.
So utilitarianism is basically an outlook. So the question is how does competency relate to utilitarianism? And what was the other one?
Elitism.
Elitism. Okay. So let me make an attempt at answering the question, and then you guys go ahead and add whatever you want. But I think that what you have with competency is the ideal that people should be competent to manage their own affairs and conduct their own, lives and pursue their own interests. And in order for that to happen, they have to be, in large part, trusted and left alone, which leaves elites with nothing to do. So elites hate having nothing to do. The elites love to tell other people what to do. And utilitarianism is a philosophy that sort of instrumentalizes people and says, okay, my way of sort of dealing with you is you do this or do this. Who was the guy that was behind scientific management? You remember it was like early 20th century. Is it Winslow something? Yeah, I'm just drawing a blank in the name. But this was a guy who developed a sort of an approach to managing human beings that he described as scientific management, where he would time you for your various movements. And he realized
Taylor?
Yep, that's it. Taylor. That's it. If I can, sort of script or choreograph all of your movements and make them repetitive, I can make a human machine of various parts in which each part has zero idea what's going on, except I do. I know what's going on. And then you're all kind of fitted together. So utilitarianism gives me the kind of mental framework within which to do that. And, with this outlook, there's certainly a lot to be said for efficiency. It did lead to more efficiency, but it also led to less freedom to, sort of be creative. And what did they do? Well, that's where the hobby movement came in. That's where, you go home and you have your hobbies, where you allow your creative energies to run, wherever they want to go. But at work, you just do as you're told. So it's happening. We see it in places like McDonald's. I mean, that's the way McDonald's works. But we see it increasingly even in more sophisticated firms. Like standard work is a term that's used sometimes in, kind of high-tech environments. So I had a number of friends who were and parishioners who were at, I think, Pratt & Whitney back in Connecticut, and they were in management, and they were commiserating over the fact that there was a strong push to standardize everything so that people would be interchangeable, that no one would be indispensable. Yeah. Which at one level makes sense, but at another level just means you're a machine.
The thing that I would add to that is that elites aren't concerned about even their own competency. They're concerned about their credentials.
Yeah.
And credentialing and competency are two different things.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, when you talk about competency, you have to ask the question, what do you mean? The kind of competency you're talking about is one thing, but being competent at your job or something like that, Taylorism gets you there. You're right. Competent at your job. You're capable of doing it. So what do we mean by it? I would say in the case of the elites, it is not even an issue. What matters is the credential, which is one of the reasons why universities are so critical to production of elites, because what they do is they give credentialing. Mm-hmm. And the more elite the university, the more the credential is worth.
Yeah. And I think, too, this is one of the reasons why they're so put out by people like Zuckerberg and Musk, who just sort of like thumb their nose at the credentialing scene and just say, I'm just going to build a rocket to go to Mars. So goodbye.
Yeah. And then they're even more annoyed when they do it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
I think elites are going through existential crisis because of egalitarianism. For centuries, elites, what made you elite was because you lived in a hierarchical world where you were elite because you were Theodoric, the Ostrogoth king that conquered Italy, right? That's what made you elite. Today, it's like, well, what makes you elite? Like, we don't really know. So credentials or something makes us elite. So,
Yeah.
And that's why they hate Elon Musk, because
Right.
he's elite because of his merit, not because of credentials or birthright.
Right. So the comment was made that elites are going through a kind of existential crisis because the old sort of a way of belonging to an elite is no longer in place. So, we don't have the aristocracy that we once had. And consequently, the question is within a society that's egalitarian, how do you distinguish yourself as elite? And that's why we have credentials, as, taking the place of these other forms of elitism. Any thoughts on that?
Sounds right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do think that we won't ever have a world without elites. The question is how do we have good ones? How so, like, when you think about certain people in the past, um, we have stories about them that seem to indicate that they were in touch with the situation on the ground in a way that people who are elites today are not. you know, they have so, like, for example, in New England, the old Brahmin class, as you guys know about, the old WASP elites, it was pretty much a expectation that you would have some time in the military. You'd be a lieutenant or a captain or something in the military. You'd have a period of time in the military, and that would harden you. That would also help you to understand the necessity of military force being applied in certain situations, and it would also give you direct experience with what? People from the other social classes. You don't see that anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to add that one of the things I remember from my experience, both at Duke and Oxford, but in particular Oxford, where I went to school with a lot of our senators' children and things like that, is, you could have academic competence. That's what allowed me to get where I was, but I definitely was not in the elite group, and they can smell that you're not one of them.
Yep.
You just, it's all down to your manner and everything else. It's incredible.
Well, they are very astute at picking up on the subtle clue of social class. It's really, I agree. I remember did I ever tell you guys about the time when I was invited to that men's club in Boston, the Union Club?
I don't think so.
Talk about it. So the Union Club, I was actually invited by George Bush's cousin, Jamie Bush. So he invited me to this, and you walk in, and it's just like right out of Phineas Fogg and Around the World in 80 Days. They got the mahogany paneling and the big leatherback chairs and the guys and the that look like they just were mummified. and then right on the table in the foyer, right there is the New England Registry of Genealogy. Guess what that's supposed to communicate? The old families.
Yeah.
And it was called the Union Club because it was founded over a split. There had been another club that had split over the Civil War, and this was the side that sided with the Union. So actually, there were sympathizers of the South in Boston, and they had a different club on the other side of the Boston Common. The little-known fact. Yep.
I want to repeat a question Glenn asked. It was either a serious question or a rhetorical question, I don't know which, but elites in the negative sense. Some of us have been listening to the podcast that Kevin DeYoung had with Aaron Wren, where he argues for righteous elites, and he's ditching the word elites because of the baggage and arguing for excellence. But in the negative sense of elites that we've been talking about tonight, what Glenn asked earlier, what do they want? So I would ask the same question, do they want to be God? Is that essentially how we would summarize their sin? In which case that would be consistent with what you said, Chris, that it's not that they believe that they're right, they believe it's right because they do it, which is to say I'm God. I mean, is that what they want?
Yeah, that's a good point, Aaron. Well, so the question is what's behind the thinking here? Why do they conduct themselves in this way? Do they just think that they're right because of who they are, or is there some agenda that they're pursuing? Is that kind of the thing you're getting at?
Yeah, how would you summarize the sin or the
Summarize
error
the sin.
in the simplest form? Is it a desire to be God?
Yeah. So is this a desire to be God, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, the best that I can do with this, I think this was in reference to my comments about the obvious lies that are being propagated about COVID and the vaccines and things like that. The best that I can do with it, I know some people think it's all about the money. And I'm sure that for a pharmaceutical company, maybe Fauci, some others, money is going to be part of it. But I really don't think that's it. Because how much more money do you really need? I mean, are you really willing to kill people over money? Maybe they are. Avarice is one of the 7 deadly sins, and I get that. I think, though, that it is something that is less tangible than that. My suspicion is it's fundamentally about power, which in a critical theory world is the only it's the only reality. I think it's about the idea that this becomes a means, a prototype, a test case for control of the population, and that it really is about working to build your vision of a utopia, or at least that's what they're telling themselves. Because if we can only get these idiot rubes out there to do what we tell them to do, then we can bring in the kind of world that we know will be better for everybody. I think that's the lie they're telling themselves. That's the best I can do with it.
And this is tied to, people's suspicions that the current, wars and regime changes are very similar. That if you have countries and leaders in the way, we have to dismantle them. We have to get them out of the way.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. A couple of thoughts come to my mind. One is C.S. Lewis, in his discussion of the sin of pride in Mere Christianity. He brings to the surface the fact that it's essentially a competitive vice. In other words, yes, it isn't that you really need any more money. It's just that you need more money than that guy. It's about the comparison. It's about the competition. But I also think, related to what you're talking about, Tom, I think there's also, we've talked sometimes about plausible, the plausible deniability of something. You can actually be up to something and be able to deny you're up to it because it's plausible that you're up to something else. Well, it kind of works the other way around. So when it comes to regime change, well, yeah, your point is absolutely right. But at the same time, it's awfully convenient that we really do have a scumbag out there that we can remove.
well, that's
it gives us the justification to do what we want.
That's right. I mean, and that's sort of that's the thing. It was the same way with let's connect that scumbag with the other scumbag here and get rid of them. I mean, they're convenient. They're politically convenient and elite. The elites can and all you have a whole. I know people here in Connecticut that just mention the name of any of these figures and they will go into a frenzy. These are educated people, they'll go into almost, they'll be triggered, I guess is the word they use. And it's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's just good that they're incompetent when it comes to exercising physical force, because you can just kind of look at them, melt down and just say, wow, that's kind of interesting. And you're not actually afraid of anything they can do. So, so we have Gideon. I want to get somebody we not had. Yep.
Yeah. So I wonder, listening to this conversation, I was actually thinking about that conversation with Aaron Wren and Kevin DeYoung also, but I don't think Aaron's quite right in some of his analysis. Like, one of the things he says in there is that the rural classes or the rural parts of America are completely irrelevant. Really, it just comes down to these elite centers. I think that's fundamentally flawed. I think we're actually buying into the lie. I think back of the podcast you guys did fairly recently dealing with the internet and its influence on people and how it's actually probably somewhat demonic in a lot of its nature. And yet, how much time do we spend on that, affirming and giving credence to these elites as opposed to spending time in our real lives, raising our real families, talking to our real neighbors in real conversation, being about real stuff. I think in a lot of ways, we, as people in this room or as a church, are just totally buying into the lie and feeding into this elitism as we are railing against it. We're just doing the same thing in a lot of levels. So how do we change that to where we are people who are actually in each other's lives, in the lives of those around us, focused on raising our families, and to a large part just completely ignoring the elites, because that's what will un-elite the elite.
Yeah. So let's see if I could summarize this. The comments made that maybe this is my paraphrase, that maybe we take the elites too seriously, that really we have more going for us than we think we do, that we ought to focus more on our own sort of community, getting involved with the people around us and making things better. And there is and one of the comments had to do with sometimes there is a sense that we are given that the only way we'll be able to say take America back or change things for the better is by becoming elites ourselves or bringing the elites over onto our team or something like that. Do you have any thoughts about that, guys?
Yeah, I don't think that's. I mean, I think the church's vision of its mission and task, and seek ye first the kingdom of God and the wealth of His righteousness, cannot be basically equated with that form of kind of play with power the way it's ordered currently. I think one of the reasons why I analyze it and look at this, because I do think that this impacts all of us in ways we don't think about. One of the directions I was going to go in with what we talked about was the way in which we become so used to, with language, for example, subtleties and nuance that constantly shades and distorts truth, that we also, even as Christians, sometimes become very loose with our language, and we don't watch what we say so carefully. And so we start taking on patterns that have been kind of established by, a lot of the education system and the elites for whatever purposes, and it goes all the way down to the church. So truth telling and being committed to a different form of life that is radically countercultural is not an easy thing to do. But one of the ways of sticking to the mission of the church and its priorities is also to be aware that these things are impacting us and help bring to consciousness, if you will, the way in which we can get sucked into those domains without in practices without even fully being aware that we're being impacted by them. And I think the evangelical church, especially the role that it has had in American culture for so long, and as you're starting to see that kind of erode and people holding on to what places they're given, you see those compromises take place that impact local communities and the church's identity.
Yeah, the thing that I would add is that it's hard to ignore it when you're getting it from all of the media, or nearly all of the media. You're getting it from Google and Meta and Twitter and pretty much all of the major players in Silicon Valley, both in terms of social media and in terms of hardware and software, where you're getting it from the political field, where it's being taught in the public schools. We can't ignore it. I mean, it's there. It's pretty close to ubiquitous right now.
Yeah.
Ubiquitous and iniquitous. In one sense, I agree with you. One of the things we need to be focusing on is what we can do, which is typically building local communities, strengthening things that way, homeschool networks, all of these kinds of things. Yes, we should be doing that. But at the same time, we can't ignore the larger pressures that are going on within society. If nothing else, then because God tells us we have to love our neighbor. And loving our neighbor means speaking the truth in love.
Truth in love, yeah.
Well, just one last follow-up. We should wrap
I
up.
was going to say, not to the point of ignoring it, like, I think keeping our eye on what's going on and yet not getting distracted to the point where hours of our day is just consumed in
Right.
wondering what's happening in the media or what's happening in, everywhere else to the detriment of what's actually going on around us and what we can actually change and influence in order to raise up people that will impact the next generation and be faithful themselves.
Right. That's good stuff. Good word. Well, why don't we wrap up with that? Thank you for listening to this extended version or this addition to or addendum to the Theology Pugcast and our latest episode. And we appreciate the folks here in Huntsville, Alabama. Say goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
All right.